The escaped prisoners thought they picked the easiest target that night. An elderly black woman, walking home with groceries, shoulders tired, steps slow. "Grab her," their leader whispered. "She won't fight back." They were wrong. The moment the sack went over her head, the quiet night shattered. A thud, a scream, bones cracking in the dark. By the time they dragged her into the abandoned barn, 3 men were already on the ground, groaning, confused, terrified. The oldest prisoner spat blood and stared at her in disbelief. "What are you?" he whispered. She straightened her back, cracked her neck, and gave him a look no civilian had ever seen. Calm, cold, assessing. The look of someone who had ended wars long before these men ever learned to run. No one knew it yet, but the woman they had just kidnapped was a former Delta Force commander, a ghost the military still had classified. And the next 5 minutes would become the most humiliating fight of their lives. Stay with me until the end, because what she does next made even the FBI reconsider who the real threat was that night. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Margaret Thompson had been walking this same route for 15 years. Every Tuesday evening, she'd finish her shift at the community center, stop by Miller's grocery store, and make the 8-block trek back to her small apartment on Oak Street. The neighborhood wasn't what it used to be. Everyone knew that. But Margaret had never been one to change her routine out of fear. At 72, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every step mattered. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her worn sneakers quiet against the cracked sidewalk. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a tired grandmother heading home with a bag of groceries and a carton of milk. But appearances, as these men were about to discover, could be devastatingly deceiving. The 5 escaped prisoners had been on the run for 3 days. Their orange jumpsuits had been ditched for stolen clothes that didn't quite fit, their faces unshaven and desperate. They'd broken out of Millfield Correctional during a transfer gone wrong, and now every law enforcement agency in 3 states was hunting them. Danny Kowalski, their self-appointed leader, had been scanning the quiet residential streets for the perfect target. Someone vulnerable, someone who wouldn't put up a fight, someone who would give them exactly what they needed, a hostage to bargain with, and a safe place to regroup. When he spotted Margaret turning onto the dimly lit Oak Street, he knew they'd found their mark. "There," he whispered to the others, pointing at her slow, steady figure. "Easy money." The plan was simple. Surround her, grab her, get her somewhere quiet, and figure out their next move. These weren't sophisticated criminals. They were desperate men who'd spent years behind bars dreaming of freedom and had no idea what to do with it now that they had it. Marcus Webb, the youngest of the group at 26, shifted nervously. "You sure about this, Danny? She's just an old lady." "That's exactly why I'm sure," Danny hissed back. "You want to try taking down some college kid who's going to scream and run? Or you want someone who's going to freeze up and do what we tell her?" The other 3, Rico Santos, Tommy Chen, and Big Mike Patterson, nodded in agreement. They'd all been inside for violent crimes, but none of them had ever felt comfortable with the idea of hurting elderly people. In their minds, this would be quick and clean. Scary for her, sure, but nobody would get hurt. They had no idea they were about to make the biggest tactical error of their lives. Margaret noticed them before they thought she did. Her peripheral vision caught the movement in the alley to her left, the way shadows shifted where they shouldn't have. Her hearing, still sharp despite her age, picked up the whispered conversation and the subtle sound of footsteps trying too hard to be quiet. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have dropped their groceries and run, or fumbled for their phone, or started screaming for help. Margaret Thompson was not most people. Instead, she did something that would have seemed bizarre to any civilian, but made perfect sense to someone with her background. She began conducting a rapid tactical assessment of her environment. 5 hostels, she noted mentally. scanning without turning her head. One in the alley, two approaching from behind, one crossing the street to cut off forward movement, one staying back as overwatch. Classic pincer movement, though poorly executed. The street was empty except for a few parked cars. The nearest house with lights on was about 50 yards ahead. No immediate backup available. Multiple escape routes, but all compromised by hostile positioning. Most importantly, they clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. Margaret Thompson, or rather Colonel Margaret Thompson, retired, had spent 28 years in the United States Army. The last 12 of those years had been with Delta Force, back when women weren't supposed to be there, back when she'd had to be twice as good as everyone else just to earn half the respect. She'd run black ops missions in places that didn't officially exist, had trained soldiers who went on to become legends themselves, and had earned a chest full of medals that most people would never know about because her service record was still classified. The grocery bag in her left hand contained milk, bread, and canned soup. But Margaret's mind was already calculating how that bag could become a weapon, how the environment around her could be used to her advantage, and exactly how long it would take to neutralize 5 untrained hostiles. "Now," Danny whispered, into his cheap walkie-talkie. They moved like amateurs. Rico came at her from the front, hands outstretched, trying to look intimidating. Tommy and Marcus flanked her from behind, one carrying what looked like a burlap sack. Big Mike crossed the street, his massive frame intended to block any escape route. Danny stayed in the alley, thinking he was being tactical. What they didn't realize was that Margaret had been tracking all of their movements for the past 2 blocks, had already identified their weapons. None. And their skill level, non-existent. "Ma'am," Rico called out, his voice trying to sound commanding but coming across as nervous. "We need you to come with us. Don't make this difficult." Margaret stopped walking. She set her grocery bag down carefully, straightened her back, and turned to face them with the kind of calm that should have been their first warning. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and surprisingly strong, "I think you may have made a mistake." Marcus laughed nervously. "No mistake, lady. Just do what we tell you, and nobody gets hurt." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a chess master studies a board. "How old are you, son?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "I asked how old you are." 26, he stammered, not sure why he was answering. 26, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Were you planning to see 27? The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in a grandmother's voice. Tommy stepped forward with the burlap sack, thinking the old woman was just trying to stall. That's when Margaret Thompson stopped being a tired grandmother walking home from the grocery store. That's when she became what she'd always been underneath, one of the most lethal human beings the United States military had ever produced. The first move came faster than any of them could process. Tommy reached forward with the burlap sack, confident this would be over in seconds. Margaret's right hand shot up, catching his wrist in a grip that made him gasp. Her left hand drove into his solar plexus with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees instantly. Before Rico could react, Margaret had already pivoted, using Tommy's falling body as a shield while her elbow found the sweet spot just below Rico's ribcage. The sound he made wasn't quite a scream, more like the air being violently expelled from a punctured tire. Marcus, still processing what he was seeing, made the mistake of rushing her from behind. Margaret heard his heavy footsteps, sidestepped at the last possible moment, and used his own momentum against him. Her hip became a fulcrum as she threw him over her shoulder, sending all 200 pounds of him crashing into a parked car with enough force to set off the alarm. Big Mike, across the street, stared in absolute shock. 3 of his partners were down in less than 15 seconds, and the old woman hadn't even broken a sweat. Danny emerged from the alley, his face twisted in disbelief and rage. "What the hell is happening out here?" Margaret turned toward him, her breathing still completely controlled, her posture relaxed but ready. Behind her, Tommy was curled in a ball, gasping for air. Rico had managed to crawl behind a nearby car, clutching his ribs, Marcus wasn't moving at all. "What's happening?" Margaret said calmly. "Is that you boys picked the wrong grandmother." Danny's hand moved toward his waistband, where he'd tucked a knife he'd fashioned in prison. Margaret's eyes tracked the movement instantly, her body shifting almost imperceptibly into a combat stance that had been drilled into her muscle memory decades ago. "I wouldn't," she advised, her tone conversational. "You're already down 3 men, and I haven't even started trying yet." Big Mike finally found his voice from across the street. "Danny, man, we need to go. This ain't normal. This ain't right." But Danny's pride was wounded. In his mind, he was still the leader of this crew, still the man who'd orchestrated their escape. He couldn't let some old woman make him look weak. The knife came out of his waistband in a clumsy, telegraphed motion that Margaret read like a children's book. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as like watching a masterclass in violence. Margaret didn't retreat or flinch. Instead, she moved forward, inside Danny's knife range, faster than a woman her age had any right to move. Her left hand caught his wrist, controlling the weapon, while her right hand drove upward into his nose with enough force to send him stumbling backward, blood streaming down his face. The knife clattered to the pavement as Danny tried to clear his vision. Margaret kicked it away without taking her eyes off him, then stepped back to assess the situation. 4 men down, one still standing across the street, looking like he was seriously reconsidering his life choices. "Mike," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the quiet street. "That's your name, right? Big Mike?" He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. "Mike, you seem like the smartest one in this group, so I'm going to give you some advice. Take your friends here and walk away. Find the nearest police station and turn yourselves in. Tell them you made a mistake tonight, that you're sorry, and that you want to go back to prison peacefully." Big Mike looked at his crew, Tommy still gasping on the ground, Rico groaning behind the car, Marcus unconscious against the Honda, Danny trying to stop his nose from bleeding. Then he looked back at Margaret, standing there like she'd just finished watering her garden instead of dismantling 5 grown men. "What are you?" he whispered, echoing the question Danny had asked earlier. Margaret smiled, and for the first time that night, it wasn't a grandmother's smile. It was something else entirely, something that belonged to dark operations in foreign countries, to classified missions that never made the news, to a woman who'd spent decades being the thing that monsters had nightmares about. "I'm retired," she said simply. But Big Mike was already backing away, his survival instincts finally overriding his loyalty to the crew. He turned and ran, leaving his partners behind without a second thought. Margaret watched him disappear around the corner, then turned her attention to the 4 men still in various states of consciousness around her. Tommy had managed to sit up, his breathing slowly returning to normal. Rico was trying to crawl away. Marcus was stirring slightly. Danny was leaning against a streetlight, holding his nose and staring at her with a mixture of fear and confusion. She picked up her grocery bag, checking to make sure the milk hadn't burst during the altercation. Satisfied that her shopping was intact, she looked back at the men she'd just defeated. "Here's what's going to happen," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones. "You're going to sit here quietly until the police arrive. You're not going to move, you're not going to run, and you're certainly not going to try anything else stupid." Danny spat blood onto the sidewalk. "You can't just keep us here. We'll leave." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made all 4 men suddenly understand that leaving wasn't really an option they had anymore. "Son," she said, pulling out her cell phone, "I've spent the last 28 years of my life learning how to stop people from going places they're not supposed to go. Trust me when I say that you're going to stay right where you are." She dialed 911 with the calm efficiency of someone who'd made similar calls in much more dangerous situations. "Yes, this is Margaret Thompson at Oak Street and Maple Avenue. I need to report an attempted kidnapping. The perpetrators are still on scene, and they'll be waiting here for you when you arrive." as she spoke to the dispatcher, providing clear, concise details about the incident. The four escaped prisoners found themselves in the surreal position of being held captive by their intended victim. None of them could quite process what had just happened to them. Tommy, still clutching his stomach, managed to wheeze out a question. "Lady, what the hell did you used to do for a living?" Margaret ended her call and looked down at him with something that might have been sympathy. "I used to solve problems," she replied. "Big problems. Problems that required very specific solutions." The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing steadily louder as they approached Oak Street. Within minutes, 3 police cruisers had surrounded the scene, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across Oak Street. The officers who stepped out weren't prepared for what they found. 4 escaped prisoners sitting obediently on the sidewalk, like scolded children, while a 72-year-old woman stood calmly beside her grocery bag, looking like she'd just finished a pleasant evening stroll. Officer Janet Rodriguez was the first to approach Margaret, her hand resting cautiously on her service weapon. She'd been a cop for 12 years, had seen plenty of strange situations, but this one didn't make sense. "Ma'am, are you Margaret Thompson? You called about an attempted kidnapping?" Margaret nodded, extending her driver's license with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout the entire encounter. "These 4 gentlemen tried to abduct me about 10 minutes ago. I believe they're escaped prisoners based on their conversation and general desperation." Rodriguez looked from Margaret to the 4 men, then back to Margaret. Danny was still holding his bloody nose. Tommy was massaging his ribs. Rico hadn't stopped groaning, and Marcus was just starting to regain full consciousness. "And you subdued all 4 of them by yourself?" "They subdued themselves, really," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "I just provided some gentle guidance on why their plan wasn't going to work." Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything the city had to offer, crouched down next to Danny. "Son, you want to tell me what happened here?" Danny looked up at him with eyes that still held traces of shock and confusion. "Man, I don't even know. We were just trying to grab her for a hostage situation, you know? Easy target. Next thing I know, I'm eating pavement and she's standing over us like some kind of—" He trailed off, unable to find the words. "Like some kind of what? Like she's done this before. Like she's done this a lot." Morrison glanced back at Margaret, who was patiently answering Officer Rodriguez's questions with military precision. Her responses were clear, chronological, and contained exactly the right amount of detail. Not too much, not too little. It reminded him of how soldiers testified in court. "Ma'am," Rodriguez was saying, "I have to ask, do you have any kind of law enforcement or military background? Because what you did here tonight is pretty remarkable for a civilian." Margaret's pause was so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Rodriguez did. So did Detective Morrison, who'd started listening more carefully. "I'm retired," Margaret said simply, the same answer she'd given Big Mike earlier. "Retired from what, exactly?" Another pause, this one longer. Margaret looked at the detective with the kind of assessment that made him suddenly aware of his posture, his weapon placement, and the fact that he was dealing with someone who saw things differently than most people. "Government work," she replied finally. "Nothing exciting. Mostly paperwork and training exercises." It was technically true, Morrison realized. If you considered classified operations in hostile territories and advanced combat training to be paperwork and exercises. By this time, word had spread through the police department's radio network. 4 escaped prisoners had been captured, not by a SWAT team or a manhunt operation, but by an elderly woman on a grocery run. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the shift supervisor, had driven over personally to see the situation for herself. She arrived to find the 4 prisoners being loaded into separate patrol cars, all of them strangely compliant and quiet. Usually, when they caught escapees, there was attitude, resistance, demands for lawyers. These men looked like they wanted nothing more than to go back to their cells and forget this night had ever happened. "Thompson," Chen called out, approaching Margaret. "I'm Lieutenant Chen." I wanted to thank you personally for what you did tonight. These men have been on our priority list for 3 days. Margaret nodded politely. I'm glad I could help, Lieutenant, though I suspect they'll be much easier to handle going forward. Sometimes people just need a reality check about their capabilities. Chen studied Margaret's face, looking for some clue about what had really happened on this quiet street. Mrs. Thompson, off the record, what exactly did you do to them? Because I've arrested a lot of violent criminals in my career, and I've never seen any of them this subdued. Margaret smiled, and Chen caught a glimpse of something underneath the grandmother exterior, something sharp and disciplined and utterly uncompromising. I showed them that their assumptions were incorrect, Margaret said. People make a lot of assumptions based on appearances. Age, gender, size. Sometimes those assumptions can be very dangerous. As the patrol cars drove away with their prisoners, Chen found herself thinking about Margaret's words. She'd run the woman's name through the system while her officers were taking statements, but the results had been oddly limited. Margaret Thompson had a clean record. No arrests, no warrants. But there were gaps in her employment history, long stretches where the databases showed nothing at all. Meanwhile, in the back of the lead patrol car, Danny was trying to explain to Officer Martinez what had happened, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. You gotta understand, man, we weren't trying to hurt her. We just needed a hostage, you know? Someone to help us get out of the city. She looked like an easy mark. Martinez glanced in the rearview mirror. How'd that work out for you? That woman ain't normal, Danny muttered, touching his swollen nose gingerly. Normal people don't move like that. Normal people don't hit like that. She knew exactly what she was doing every second. Maybe you just underestimated her. Danny shook his head emphatically. Nah, man. This wasn't about underestimating. This was about running into someone who's been trained to handle situations like us. Professional trained. In the second patrol car, Tommy was having a similar conversation with Officer Park. She called me son, he said, staring out the window, like she felt sorry for me. Even while she was putting me down, she felt sorry for me. Maybe she's just a nice lady who knows self-defense. Tommy laughed bitterly. Self-defense? Man, that wasn't self-defense. That was tactical neutralization. She didn't just fight us off. She controlled the entire situation from start to finish. She knew where each of us was, what we were going to do before we did it, and exactly how to stop us with minimal effort. Back on Oak Street, the crowd of curious neighbors who'd gathered to watch the excitement was beginning to disperse. Margaret had given her statement, provided her contact information, and politely declined the lieutenant's offer of a ride home. I only live 2 blocks from here, she'd explained, and I still need to put my groceries away. As she picked up her bag and started walking toward her apartment, Detective Morrison fell into step beside her. He'd been a cop long enough to know when someone wasn't telling the whole truth, and Margaret Thompson was definitely not telling the whole truth. Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me walking with you. After what happened tonight, I'd feel better making sure you get home safely. Margaret smiled. That's very kind of you, Detective, though I think we've established that I can take care of myself. Yes, ma'am, we certainly have. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. They walked in comfortable silence for half a block, before Morrison worked up the courage to ask the question that was bothering him. Mrs. Thompson, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen martial artists, I've seen military veterans, I've seen professional fighters. What you did tonight was different. It wasn't just skill, it was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that comes from very specific training. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She was considering how much truth she could safely share without raising questions she wasn't authorized to answer. Detective, she said finally, some people spend their lives learning how to build things. Others learn how to fix things. I learned how to stop things that needed to be stopped. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in her tone, not threatening, but absolute. The voice of someone who'd made difficult decisions in difficult places and lived with the consequences. They'd reached Margaret's building, a modest 3-story apartment complex with a small garden in front. She paused at the entrance, keys in hand. Detective Morrison, can I give you some advice? Of course, ma'am. Those 4 men you arrested tonight, they're going to be different now. What happened here changed their perspective on what's possible and what isn't. They'll be less likely to underestimate people in the future, which might actually make them slightly less dangerous. But they'll also remember that there are people in this world who can stop them completely, and that knowledge will make them more cautious about who they choose to threaten. Morrison nodded slowly. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Margaret considered the question seriously. In my experience, Detective, it's always better when dangerous people understand their limitations. It prevents a lot of unnecessary violence. As she turned to go inside, Morrison couldn't help but ask one more question. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how many people like you are there out there? People with your kind of background? Margaret paused with her key in the lock, looking back at him with an expression that was both kind and slightly sad. More than you'd think, Detective, and fewer than we need. She disappeared into the building, leaving Morrison standing alone on the sidewalk, wondering what exactly had just happened on his quiet Tuesday night shift. Above him, a light came on in a third-floor window, and he could see Margaret's silhouette moving around what was presumably her kitchen, putting away groceries like any other elderly woman at the end of an ordinary day. But Detective Ray Morrison knew that nothing about Margaret Thompson was ordinary, and he had the distinct feeling that Oak Street had just witnessed something that would be talked about in the department for years to come. What Detective Morrison didn't know was that his instincts were about to be proven right, in ways he couldn't imagine. Because while Margaret Thompson was putting away her groceries and brewing a cup of tea 300 miles away in a secure federal facility, alarms were starting to sound. The facial recognition system had finally caught up with the night's events. Margaret's image from the police body cameras had been run through multiple databases, and somewhere deep in a classified server, a match had been found. Agent Sarah Mitchell was 3 hours into her night shift at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit when her computer screen lit up with a priority alert. She'd been reviewing case files, nursing her 4th cup of coffee when the notification appeared that made her sit up straight and reach for her secure phone. This is Agent Mitchell, Authorization 77 Alpha. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and urgent. Agent Mitchell, we have a Code 7 situation. Are you familiar with Operation Nightfall? Mitchell felt her blood pressure spike. Operation Nightfall was so classified that most federal agents didn't even know it existed. I have Level 4 clearance on Nightfall materials. Good. We need you to review an incident report from tonight. 4 escaped prisoners in custody, neutralized by a civilian. The civilian's identity has triggered multiple flags in our system. Mitchell's fingers were already flying across her keyboard, accessing the secure servers. What kind of flags? The kind that suggest our civilian isn't as civilian as she appears. Margaret Thompson, age 72, current resident of Oak Street, City of Millbrook. But according to our deeper databases, Margaret Thompson was also Colonel M. Thompson, Delta Force, retired with full honors after 28 years of service. Mitchell pulled up the police report, scanning the details quickly. 4 violent criminals, all in their 20s and 30s, all with extensive records of assault and battery, all subdued by a grandmother in less than 15 minutes. Sir, what's the concern here? Sounds like she did exactly what we'd want a former Delta operator to do. The pause on the other end of the line told her there was more to this story. Agent Mitchell, Colonel Thompson's service record is still classified at the highest levels. Her retirement wasn't standard. She was part of a program that officially never existed, working in theaters of operation that we still can't acknowledge. Mitchell felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard whispers about programs like that. Soldiers who'd been so deeply embedded in black operations that their very existence was a national security risk. People who knew things that could never be allowed to surface. What do you need me to do? We need you to drive to Millbrook tonight. Interview Thompson, assess the situation, and determine if tonight's incident has compromised her cover in any way. If it has, the voice trailed off. But Mitchell understood the implications. "Understood, sir. I'm en route." As Agent Mitchell grabbed her keys and badge, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was about to become much more complicated than a simple case of self-defense. Meanwhile, in his apartment across town, Detective Morrison was having trouble sleeping. He kept replaying the events on Oak Street, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. The way Margaret had moved, the precision of her strikes, the complete control she'd maintained throughout the entire situation, it all pointed to training that went far beyond civilian self-defense classes. He'd run her name through every database he had access to, but the results were frustratingly sparse. Margaret Thompson appeared to be exactly what she claimed: a retired government worker with no criminal record and no obvious red flags. But Morrison's instincts told him there was more to her story. Unable to sleep, he decided to do something that was technically outside his jurisdiction, but might provide some answers. He drove back to Oak Street, parking across from Margaret's apartment building, and began canvassing the neighbors who hadn't been interviewed earlier. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment directly below Margaret's, was happy to talk once Morrison showed his badge. She'd known Margaret for 5 years, ever since the older woman had moved into the building. "Oh, Margaret's wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, inviting Morrison into her living room. "Very quiet, very polite. Always helps with the heavy groceries if she sees you struggling. But you know, there's always been something different about her." "Different how?" Mrs. Chen considered the question carefully. "She's very aware, if that makes sense. Like she notices things other people don't. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her moving around upstairs. Not pacing or anything, just moving. Like she's practicing something." Morrison made notes as Mrs. Chen continued. "And there was this one time, about 2 years ago, when we had that break-in attempt in the building. You remember someone was trying to get into apartments through the fire escape? Well, Margaret was the one who caught him." "Caught him how?" Margaret Thompson finished her tea, washed her cup, and settled into her favorite chair by the window. Outside, Oak Street had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Streetlights casting long shadows where just hours ago 5 men had learned the hardest lesson of their lives. She thought about Detective Morrison's question. How many people like her were out there? The answer was complicated, wrapped in classifications and secrets that would never see daylight. But tonight had been a reminder that some skills never fade, that some instincts never dull, and that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people carry the most extraordinary stories. The federal agents would come eventually. They always did when someone like her surfaced in public records. They'd ask their questions, run their assessments, and ultimately decide that Margaret Thompson was exactly what she appeared to be: a retired woman who'd simply defended herself against criminals. Because that's exactly what had happened. Nothing more, nothing less. The 4 prisoners would serve their time, probably with a new understanding of what real strength looked like. Big Mike would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering who else out there might not be what they seemed. And somewhere in classified files, tonight's incident would be noted, filed away, and forgotten by everyone except the people who lived it. Margaret smiled as she turned off the lights and headed to bed. Tomorrow was Wednesday, which meant her volunteer shift at the Veterans Center. There would be young soldiers there, struggling with their own transitions from military to civilian life, learning that the hardest battles sometimes came after the war was over. She had stories to share with them. Not tonight's story, that one would stay where it belonged, in the quiet corners of Oak Street.